All right, good morning, everyone. We're ready to get started. Thank you all for joining. Of course, as usual, if anybody has any questions, I'd like this to be as interactive as we can. So you can either throw them into the chat, I'll keep an eye on the chat window, or you can chime in, just unmute yourself and chime in and interrupt me. So this week's Parsha, Parshas Vayigash, as some of you may have seen on Facebook, I pointed out what appears to be a coincidence between what's going on in our world and what's going on in the Parsha. Because as we know, the Congress has finally worked out another economic stimulus package to address the economic effects of the pandemic, the devastating economic effects. And at the same time, this week's Parsha, we'll be reading about how Yosef addresses the economic fallout of the terrible famine that was predicted in the dreams of Paro, and for which Yosef is now responsible. Of course, this economic stimulus package, we woke up this morning to find out that the president doesn't like it, and he thinks it should give even more benefit to the people. We're not going to comment on the politics, of course. We're here to talk about the Parsha. But it is interesting to think about some of these issues that are going on in our world through the events of our Parsha. And perhaps maybe we'll have an observation or two along the way, but that's definitely not my primary focus. My primary focus is to study the Parsha and learn its lessons. And so in most years, I love to talk about the encounter, the dramatic encounter between Yehuda and Yosef, Vayigash Yehuda, which is one of the most powerful moments in the Torah, just to see these two individuals confront each other in this way, especially Yehuda. But this year I'm doing something different because I happen to be thinking about this part of the Parsha based on current events, and there's a lot to question here. There's a lot to understand. As I said, we're in Perek Mem Zayin, chapter 47, Pasuk Yud Gimel, verse 13, 264 in the Art Scroll, 259 if you're using the Steinsaltz Chumash like myself. And here in Pasuk Yud Gimel, 257. I turned the page. 257 in the Steinsaltz, 264 in the Art Scroll. If we start reading in Pasuk Yud Gimel, it's in the middle of a parak, as you see, and it says, "V'lechem ein b'chol haaretz ki chaved harav ma'od." There's no bread in the land because the famine is very serious. Now, the context. I mean, we understand the context. We know what's going on, but just to remind ourselves that this comes in, right? This observation, this report comes in right after Yosef settles his family. Yosef settles his family in Goshen. He takes some of them to meet Paro. He makes sure they're all set up. And in the pasuk right before this one, pasuk Yud Beis, verse 12, it says, "Vayichalkel Yosef es aviv es echav es kol beis aviv lechem lefi hataf." That Yosef supported. Yosef ensured that his family was properly fed. And then the Torah immediately turns to "V'lechem ein b'chol haaretz," but there wasn't bread in the rest of the land. And perhaps there's something to make of that contrast, but we'll get back to that later. So, "V'lechem ein b'chol haaretz ki chaved harav ma'od vatela eretz Mitzrayim ve'eretz Canaan." Fascinating word, vatela. Rabbi Steinsaltz translates it as languished. The people were languishing. The people were starving. They were suffering, and time was stretching on in Eretz Yisrael and Eretz Canaan because of the famine. Vayilakeh Yosef es kol hakesef hanimtza be'eretz Mitzrayim ve'eretz Canaan b'shevra asher heim shovrim. And Yosef collected all of the silver that was found in Mitzrayim and Canaan in exchange for the food that he was distributing. Vayaveh Yosef es hakesef beis Paro, and Yosef brings all the silver to the palace of Paro. Now, this is just the beginning of a section of psukim that started with verse 13 and goes through verse 27, pasuk of Zion, that describes how the famine impacted Mitzrayim and how Yosef dealt with it. And many of the commentaries deal with the issue of what is this doing here? Why is this story of Yosef's economic activity germane to the story of the Torah? If the Torah is the story of Hashem and the Jewish people, and how Hashem made a covenant with particular families, and that family became a great nation and was given the land of Canaan, then what does the story of Yosef's economic exploits in Mitzrayim offer to that narrative? You could pull out this entire section and the Torah would read fine. There would be nothing missing. We would be able to study the Torah properly. Clearly, this isn't just a diversion. The Torah is not a history book. The Torah is not a chronicle. But one of the commentaries even says in his questioning, he says this section is more appropriate for Egyptian history, for the Egyptian history books, than for the Jewish history books. So why are we given all of these details? So what I'd like to do is just read through this section of Psukim, highlighting the places in which the commentaries take one of two different approaches. Because, obviously, if it's in the Torah and it's there to teach us lessons, then it's clearly trying to teach us something either about Yosef or about the impact on the Jewish people or the impact on the land of Canaan, or maybe this story is a prelude to the enslavement of the Jewish people, the Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim. But if it's focused on Yosef, if I just pause right here and focus on Yosef, there are two schools of thought. Either it's telling us how cruel and unforgiving Yosef was in administering, the Egyptian economy, or just the opposite. Some commentaries say it's showing the righteousness and the kindness of Yosef during these terrible years. And so I'm going to read through some of the psukim and point out where the different commentaries diverge, and then we'll try to come up with our own approach. Okay, so we read that there was no bread in Mitzrayim and Canaan, and Yosef ends up collecting all of the kesef, all of the silver that people gave over in exchange for food. Now, right off the bat, some commentaries say this is an amazing thing. It shows you the honesty of Yosef in that he didn't appropriate anything for himself. He was a diligent, conscientious servant of Paro, and whatever he earned, he gave right over to Paro, didn't keep anything for himself. He was an honest, faithful servant to Paro. On the other hand, some look negatively at this and say that Yosef, what Yosef did was really take advantage of the situation, take advantage of the terrible plight of the famine, because what food was he giving them during the years of famine? Right? That was the food, that was the produce that was collected during the years of plenty. Where did that come from? That came from the people, right? He collected the people's produce, right? They saved up during the years of plenty, and now he's selling them back their own produce. So some say that Yosef kind of tricked the Egyptians into giving up their produce in the years of plenty and then having to buy back their own produce in the years of famine. And not only that, some suggest that Yosef had a keen business sense, and that the reason why he had so much produce is maybe they didn't just appropriate it, maybe they didn't just confiscate it during the years of plenty, rather they bought it, right? That the state, the palace of Paro, bought the surplus produce during the years of plenty, and if they were years of plenty, that means produce was cheap, right? So they bought cheap during the years of plenty, and then during the years of famine, the prices go up, they skyrocket, and now they sell it back at a higher price, which is why Yosef was able to earn so much for the palace of Paro, because he bought up everything cheap and sold it at a much higher price during the years of famine. So all these fascinating details could be read in a number of different ways. But let's continue. Vayitom hakesef meretz Mitzrayim meretz Canaan. So that's it. They had whatever silver they had, they used to pay for food, and they no longer had any more. Vayavo chol Mitzrayim el Yosef lemor. All Mitzrayim comes to Yosef and says, Hava lanu lechem v'lama namus negdecha ki afes kasef. Give us bread. Why should we die? We have no more money left. Okay, so they're begging for food. They're starving. Vayomer Yosef, verse Tes Zion, pasuk 16. Vayomer Yosef, Havu miknechem ve'etnolachem miknechem imafes kasef. Okay, you guys have other property. You have other things of value. So trade in your cattle for food. Vayaviu, and they dutifully bring es miknehem el Yosef, vayitain lahem Yosef lechem basusim, uv'miknei hatzon, uv'miknei habakar, v'chamorim, all the different kinds of animals, horses, cattle, sheep, donkeys, vayinaleim balechem v'chol miknehem b'shana hahi, and he provided them with food in exchange for their animals in that year. And according to many commentators, this is the second of the 7 years of famine. The second of the 7 years. It's a debate. There's discussion which year we're talking about. Maybe it's the end of the years of famine, but let's just go with that for now. Now, this pasuk also could be read in different ways, depending on whether it could either be read favorably towards Yosef or unfavorably towards Yosef, right? Unfavorably, Yosef further took advantage of the situation to acquire even more for the palace of Paro, because now he's got all their animals. He's got all their money. He's got all their animals. And we're going to see pretty soon, he's going to take all their land. Everything has now been amassed for the state. Yosef takes advantage of the situation to rid everybody of all their property. That would be an unfavorable reading. A favorable reading would be, some commentaries suggest, just the opposite. Animals need to be fed. And if you own an animal and you're starving, you either need to divide up your food between you and your animal, your family and your animals, or you let your animals die. And so what Yosef did for them was to take a terrible obligation off their backs. And that if the palace acquired all the animals, those animals will now belong to the palace, and now the palace has to feed those animals. And the people are no longer responsible to feed those animals, and those animals are still alive, and they can be used. So you could read it favorably, that Yosef unburdened them from having to feed their animals, and now place that burden on the palace. Let's continue. Vatitom hashana hayi, that year finished. Vayavo elav bashana sheniz vayomru lo nechachei ma'adoni im tam hakesef u'miknei habehima el adoni lo nishar lifnei adoni bilti im giviyasenu ve'ad masenu. They said, okay, all right, now we need more food. You have all of our silver, you have all of our animals. All we have left are our bodies and our land. Lama namus le'inecha gam anachnu gam ad masenu kineo sonu v'esad masenu balachem v'nihiyeh anachnu v'ad masenu avadim lefaro v'senzera v'nichiev lo namus v'adama lo seisham. So why should we die, us and our fields? Buy us, purchase us in exchange for food, so that we may live, that our land not become desolate. So basically, that we and our lands will become servants to Paro. Now, when we hear the phrase avadim leparo, that clearly triggers some familiar thoughts, right? Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim, right? We were servants. So before we even get to that story of Bnei Israel becoming enslaved to Paro, here we see in this story the people of Mitzrayim offering to become slaves, offering to become servants to Paro in exchange for food. And this catches the attention of many commentaries. And again, the commentaries have a wide array of approaches. What does it mean that that they are offering themselves to be servants? Is this a prelude to the enslavement of the Jewish people? Is this perhaps some sort of negative foreshadowing. Not negative foreshadowing. I can't think of the right word. But maybe what's happening here is this is setting the groundwork for future resentments. That the Egyptians will become resentful of Yosef and perhaps extend that to his family for enslaving them. And that's what helps them to forget Yosef and to enslave Bnei Israel later on. Maybe that idea is suggested in some commentaries. But let's see what happens. Let's see how this plays out. I want to read a little more. I usually don't read this much in our class, but it's fascinating details in every step of the way here. And the Torah offers us so much detail, which is what we're trying to understand ultimately, right? There's so much detail in the economic story of the famine. There's a lot to discuss here. Vayiken Yosef es kol admas Mitzrayim lefaro ki machru Mitzrayim ish sadeo ki chazak aleim ha'ra'av. Yosef purchased all of the lands for Paro because everyone sold their land because of how severe the famine was. Vatahi haaretz lefaro. Haaretz, the land, all of the land now belonged to Paro. So Yosef earns for Paro all the silver in the land, all the animals in the land, all the land in the land. Sorry, right? All the land. And the nation, he Haviro Sole Arim, a very strange detail that comes out of nowhere. It seems unnecessary, right? And he transferred the people to cities from one end of the Egyptian border to the other. He did some sort of population transfer in the midst of all this. And again, it's not clear why he does this. The commentaries have a variety of opinions to explain this. On a simple level, perhaps it came to substantiate this notion that the people no longer. I'm just gonna move the mic closer based on a suggestion. Here we go. How's this? You hear me okay? All right, great. So perhaps the population transfer is to substantiate, to concretize the fact that they don't own the land, right? If you buy the land from someone and the person stays on that land, have you really bought it? So perhaps the population transfer was to make sure people understood, you don't own this land anymore, I'm moving you to someplace else. And all of it belongs to Paro. Let's continue reading. And then we'll reflect on all this. Rak admas hakohanim lo kana, pasuk chavbeis. Of all the land that was purchased, one type of land was not, and that was the land of the Kohanim, whatever those are, right? The Egyptian priests. They were supported by the palace directly. They didn't need to give up their land. They had a deal. They made a deal with Paro, and so their lands were not. Again, something else to understand. Well, who are these Kohanim? Why is this important? But let's continue. Vayomer Yosef el ha'am. Yosef says to the people, Hein kanisi eschem hayom vesad maschem lefaro. I have purchased you and your lands for Paro. Hey lochem zero zratem eso adama. Here now are seeds. Go plant, right? Go cultivate the land. Right? And whatever you produce, you'll give a fifth to Paro. And you keep 4/5. So that you can continue to plant and you can feed yourselves and your children. Vayomru, and the Egyptian people say, Heche yisanu. You have sustained us. You've saved our lives. Nimtzachein be'enei Adoni, let us find favor in your eyes. V'hayinu avadim lefaro, and we will be servants to Paro. Vayasem osa Yosef l'chok arayom hazeh, al admas Mitzrayim lefaro lachomesh, rak admas hakonim l'adam lo haisa lefaro, vayeshav Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen, ve'echsuva vayifru vayirbu me'od. And so that was the law. That was what was instituted. 1/5 goes to the palace. The priests didn't apply to them. During this time, the Jewish people were settled in Goshen, and they increased. Okay, so now that I've dragged you through the entire story detail by detail, let's take a step back, because I glossed over a couple things in order to make a point. And here's the point, and that is that if we look a little bit beneath the surface, more than the questions and ideas we've presented so far, we'll notice something very interesting. And in order to do that, we actually need to recognize that the story of the famine actually began in last week's Parsha. If you turn back with me for a moment to Perek Mem Aleph, chapter 41, verse 47, Mem Zayin, 41, 47. Bottom of page 228 in the art scroll, and in the Steinsaltz, it is on page 227. Vatasa arts b'sheva shnei hasava likmatzim. The earth produced during the 7 years of plenty in abundance. Right. So this is back in Parshas Miketz. This is right when Yosef succeeds in becoming the viceroy for interpreting the dreams so properly. He has a family, and lo and behold, there were 7 years of plenty. Vayikbots es kol ochel sheva shanim asher hayu be'eretz Mitzrayim vayiten ochel be'arim. And Yosef collected all of the produce, right? All of the grain for the 7 years that was in Mitzrayim. Vayitain, what does he do? Vayitain ochel be'arim. And he places the food in the cities. Ochel stei ha'ir asher svivoseha nosan besocha. In every city, Yosef stored the food in the city in which it was collected. So basically, what Yosef does is he collects all the produce, but he doesn't bring all the produce to one central location. Instead, he collects the produce regionally. Right? Local produce stayed local. Right, that's like a big thing nowadays, right? Like locally sourced vegetables, like farming, right? Whatever, that's sustainable, whatever. Anyways, that was Yosef's idea, right? Vayitzbor Yosef bar kechol hayam harbe ma'od. Yosef collected so much it was like the sand on the sea. Ad ki chadal lispor ki mispar. They were measuring, they were keeping track. They had some kind of bureaucracy, but it got pointless. They had so much. So these 3 psukim right here, there are those who point to these psukim as being very instructive, because what Yosef accomplishes by placing the produce locally and not collecting it in one centralized national location is ensuring that all this food was accessible to the people. So on a practical level, distribution is much easier if things are spread out than if everything was brought to one place, right? Kind of a genius move, although in hindsight it seems simple. But at the time, I'm sure it was no small chiddush, because the temptation is to assert control over everything, and the best way to assert control over everything is to bring everything into one location and place it under your control. But what Yosef does instead is he addresses the issue regionally or locally. And there are some who suggest that the reason for this wasn't just for practicality, it was also for peace of mind, for reassurance. That everyone would know that there was food when the famine came, right? That you weren't necessarily, as Yosef was collecting all of the surplus, he wasn't moving it out into a place where they would never see it again. No, he kept it locally. So every farmer who gave up his surplus or sold his surplus knew exactly where it was. It was at the local granary. It was at the local silos. And that provided the people with reassurance. Because the other observation to make here is what happens during the time of famine, right? What happens to people psychologically, right? It breeds instability, right? People become nervous. People become afraid. People are hungry. They become desperate. People rebel. Mobs form, and it creates all sorts of. It could create all sorts of chaos. But in order to prevent that chaos, in order to keep people reassured and confident that they would be taken care of, Yosef ensures that the grain be stored locally. But what's interesting, though, is if you look at Pasuk Memches here, verse 48 versus verse 49. So it's interesting. One of the commentaries contrasts the two psukim because in verse 48, it says that Yosef kept it all in the individual cities. In 49, though, it says Vayitzbor Yosef bar, which makes it sound like Yosef did do some centralized collection. So perhaps what Yosef is doing is recognizing that they need both a local supply and a national supply. Because remember, the famine is hitting Canaan just as much as Mitzrayim. And where do they go in Canaan for food? They go down to Mitzrayim, as we know from Yaakov and his sons. So clearly there was a national supply that was maintained as well, right? That foreigners could buy from. So those are the two things that I want to note first. That number one, that it was kept locally in order to create this sense of reassurance, of peace of mind. And number two is Yosef was able to balance between having the locals reassured and yet also having a national supply. The Orach Chaim makes a fascinating observation. Stay here with me in chapter 41, Mem Aleph, and go to Pasuk Nun Gimel for a moment. What does it say in Pasuk Nun Gimel? Vatichlena sheva shnei hasava. The 7 years of plenty finished. Asher hayab Mitzrayim. Vatichilena sheva shnei harav lavo kasher amar Yosef. And now the 7 years of famine began to arrive as Yosef had predicted. Vayehi ra'av b'chol haratzos u'b'chol eretz Mitzrayim hayalachem. In all the other lands, the famine was hitting hard, but in Mitzrayim they had food. Vatirav kol eretz Mitzrayim vayitzaka am el parol alachem v'yomer parol lechol Mitzrayim luchu el Yosef asher yomar lachem ta'asu. Right? And then the famine started hitting Mitzrayim. They went to Paro, and Paro said, "Go to Yosef." V'harav hayal pnei kol haaretz al kol pnei haaretz vayiftach Yosef es kol asher behem vayishbor leMitzrayim ve'achazak hara'av be'eretz Mitzrayim. So what does Yosef do? Yosef opens up. Vayiftach Yosef. Yosef opens up everything that they had, and he started to feed Mitzrayim. And the famine grew more severe. And everyone in the region started coming to get food. Now there's some who see the word vayishbor as not just supplying food, but to ration. Vayishbor means you get your proper allotment. And so the Orach Chaim notices that there are two contradictory things going on here in Pasuk Nun Vav in verse 56. Because on the one hand, it says Vayiftach Yosef, Yosef opened up, which makes it sound like everyone can just get what they want. But then it says Vayishbor, that he rationed it out. So the Orach Chaim makes the following observation, which I find so fascinating. And that is that Yosef opened up all of the local, regional storehouses of produce for people to see. Continuing that concept of affording people peace of mind and reassurance, right? So he opens up for people to see, but you can't take whatever you want. It's going to be rationed out. But if I ration out food to people and those people see that there's more to come later, then they'll be reassured. They'll have peace of mind, because it's uncertainty that can really plague someone, as we've seen from this pandemic. How much the uncertainty, even, think about the time long ago before we knew there was a vaccine coming and we didn't know how long this would go on. We still don't know how long this is going to go on. We still don't know how long it's going to take to get people vaccinated. We still don't know how things are really going to play out over the next year. And that uncertainty is deeply, deeply unsettling. And so this word, Vayiftach Yosef, the Orach Chaim points out, is showing us that what Yosef did was reassure the people in order to reduce their sense of uncertainty. Obviously, it won't last forever. And back in our Parsha, the food runs out, and then the money runs out, and then they have to use their cattle, then they have to use their land. But at least for the beginning, Yosef is creating a climate of calm, of orderliness, of rationing, but with a sense of reassurance and hope that there is more to come. And so this is how we would read this story if we were to read it for Yosef favorably, which is the approach I prefer. Let's come back now to our parsha, back to chapter 47, again 259 in the Steinsaltz Aman, and 228 or 230 in the Art Scroll. Because I think one of the most important issues to note here is this notion of the people becoming slaves, the people becoming servants. And I kind of glossed over that point in order to come back to it, because the Ramban makes a fascinating, astute observation about this concept of the people becoming slaves. Because if you read the psukim carefully, it's not as it seems at first. Right? If you look at Pasuk Yud Tes, verse 19. Oh, by the way, when I said 228 in the Art Scroll, I was totally wrong. That was chapter 41. Chapter 47 is in the Art Scroll, again, is on page 266. Yeah, 264, 266. Okay. So if we look at that pasuk Yud Tes, verse 19, Lama namus le'necha, gam anachnu gam asenu kinei osanu ves admosenu balachem. Buy us, purchase us and our land, so that we can have bread to eat. And we and our land will be servants to Paro. Now watch the next pasuk. The Ramban says, you got to read this carefully. Pasuk Chav, verse 20. Vayiken Yosef es kol admas Mitzrayim lefaro. Yosef purchases all of the land for Paro. Ki machru Mitzrayim ish sadehu ki chazak alei marav atiyars lefaro. Now, it doesn't say that Yosef purchased them. It doesn't say that Yosef bought them as slaves for Paro. And so the people offer them their bodies and their land, and Yosef says, no, I'm only taking your land. I'm not taking your bodies. You are not becoming slaves. We are not here to enslave the entire population because of the famine. And that is what earned such admiration at the end of the day through all of the struggles that the Egyptian people and the entire region had to undergo because of this famine. That's what ultimately earned Yosef the highest esteem, that while he may have amassed all their wealth and all their possessions, he did not accept their offer for them to become slaves. Now, perhaps there was a business reason for that. Because remember what I said about the animals, right? If Paro buys all the animals, that means he has to feed the animals. Perhaps Yosef didn't want to buy the people as slaves, because then Paro now owns them and has to feed them as slaves. And instead, what does Paro do? What does Yosef do, I should say, based on what the Ramban is saying, is Yosef says, no, you're not going to become slaves. You're going to become tenant farmers. And as tenant farmers, you have a stake. You have a personal stake in your own production. And that's what we find. That's what we find that he does next, right? Vayomer Yosef el ha'am, pasuk chav gimel, verse 23. Hein kanisi eschem hayom v'asmad maschem lefaro, right? I have bought you, which again, maybe this is an argument against what the Ramban's saying. Maybe he did buy them as slaves, but it's not strong enough in my mind. Hein kanisi eschem hayom v'asmad maschem lefaro. Hey lochem zero zratim esano vayavatu osu satim chamishis lefaro. He makes them tenant farmers, and he makes a deal with them, which is a pretty good deal. You guys get to keep 80% of what you produce. You work the lands that belong to Paro, but you keep 80%, and you give 20% to Paro. And by the way, there are those who read this unfavorably. There are those who say that Yosef was draconian in this measure, and that the pasuk is trying to highlight for us the difference between how Yosef treated the Egyptians versus how Hashem treats the Jewish people, that we only have to give Meiser, among other gifts, right? 10%, and yet Yosef demanded 20%. But I'd like to read it favorably. And the reason why I'd like to read it favorably is because that's how the story concludes. The people say, Heche Yisanu, you have sustained us. You have saved us. You've kept us alive. So the people clearly look at Yosef favorably. And I think this observation of the Ramban is the best demonstration of that. And so how do we understand the population transfer? Was he trying to destabilize them? Was he trying to disorient them? Was Yosef trying to disconnect them from their own land? There are some who assert that if you notice, the pasuk doesn't just say that he moved them around, right, willy-nilly, right? What does it say? It says, "V'asam ha'avir oso le'arim miktzei gevul Mitzrayim ve'ad katsehu," and some read this as follows: that Yosef did not just throw people into random places. Yosef moved them around as groups, right? That Yosef kept neighbors together with neighbors, right? He moved them city by city. And so because of that, Yosef was able to maintain some element of social cohesion even while he was moving people around. And perhaps he was moving people around because the demands of the famine, the realities of the land dictated that they needed people elsewhere. Again, it doesn't say, but what one of the things that the pasuk doesn't say is that the people rebelled against being transferred. They didn't. At the end of the day, they say, Heche Yisanu, you have sustained us. And so to me, that's the determining factor, right? You can't argue with results. That's what I would title this class. You can't argue with results. And what the pasuk presents to us is a Yosef who gets results, and the people appreciate him for getting results. Okay. Now that we've read this story this way, that it shows Yosef's brilliance, that it shows Yosef's goodness and his kindness in sustaining this entire country, indeed this entire region, and not allowing them to become slaves. So then what is this story doing here? Why do we even need this story? What does this tell us in the sweep of the entire Torah? So the first thought I had was as follows: that perhaps what the Torah is trying to teach us is the Torah is trying to set up a very deep and profound contrast between how Yosef conducted himself in Mitzrayim and how Paro, the new Paro, treated the Bnei Yisrael, and that Yosef, who follows in the traditions of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who's able to apply the values of Hashem in the real world, in the very real world, during times of struggle, was able to come up with an ethical, moral way of maintaining the economy, right? In which he had to take very austere, harsh measures in terms of buying up all the land, buying up all people's property, and yet still maintain people's dignity. He did not buy them as slaves. Again, I'm going with the approach of the Ramban. He did not take them as slaves. He was able to balance people's dignity with very harsh, difficult, painful measures. He took people's land. People had to give up their land, but he made them tenant farmers. And he made them, he gave them the opportunity to support themselves, 80%, 20%. And so here you have Yosef applying the values that I believe Hashem is happy with for Mitzrayim, this foreign nation. He's a foreigner amongst them. And yet this is how he treats them, right? He doesn't give everybody an ice cream cone. No, there are harsh measures he has to take, but at the same time, he maintains their dignity. He understands that they need reassurance, that they need comfort, that they need to know that there's going to be food, and he gives them a living. He gives them a living wage through extremely difficult times that was a pandemic, right? It affected the whole region, and Yosef was able to sustain the entire place. And that the Torah wants to contrast with the utter barbarity and cruelty of Vayaka Melech Chadash Asher Lo Yada Es Yosef. This story of Yosef here in Parshas Vayigash comes to deepen that language of Asher Lo Yada Es Yosef. He did not know Yosef. The cruelty of the Paro that enslaved the Jewish people, he didn't just enslave the Jewish people. He had not 1 ounce of the greatness of Yosef. He had not one ounce of the sense of humanity and dignity of people who may not even be your subjects directly. Right? Yosef treats the Egyptians versus how Paro treats Bnei Israel. I believe that this story, in all of its detail, in all of its rich detail, is coming to set up a very stark contrast between the greatness of Yosef in very difficult times and the utter cruelty and evil brutality of Paro, Vayaka Melech Chadash Asher Lo Yada Es Yosef. That's what I think is going on here. There's a lot going on in this story. There are many different approaches, as I mentioned. I'm just repeating myself. There are some who read this whole story as a critique of Yosef. That Yosef dealt unethically, that Yosef gave preferential treatment to the priests. He took too much from the people, 20%. He did enslave the people. Again, you can read it that way. There are details there that definitely make space for that sort of reading. That the people did become slaves to Paro in the end, right? Yosef himself says, "Hein kanisi eschem hayom v'esad maschem leparo." That approach doesn't resonate with me so well. I like the other approach, but I just wanted to be intellectually honest. All right, thank you very much for joining. If everyone has any questions, I'm happy to stick around for a second and answer them. But I hope everyone has a great day and take care and be well.
Rabbi?
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Yes.
The word you were looking for is foretelling instead of foreshadowing.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you for telling. Ruth, the Egyptians were also asked to circumcise themselves. Maybe the measure says that. I'm not sure. I don't know. But that's interesting. That's interesting. I'm not sure. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody.